let's start, I guess, with the one that I know the least about, but I was boning up before, Rick Snyder being formally charged. Rick Snyder is the former Michigan governor, if I'm not mistaken. He's a Republican, and we might touch on this in a bit as to who gets charged. So he is now being formally charged. I believe the two charges are dereliction of duty or something along those lines. And I don't know what the second charge is. I think at one point they were talking about manslaughter charges, and those are still on the table if he, apparently this is as good as it's going to get for Rick Snyder. So the Michigan Flint water crisis, everybody knows about. They diverted the water source from whatever the reservoir was to the Flint River. It was highly corrosive. Apparently, it was corroding the lead out of the pipes. Lead poisoning in a lot of people, 3 times, 4 times the average lead levels in kids. 21 people died. It was a huge crisis. Everybody knew about it. We've all heard about it. They're charging Rick Snyder with 2 charges now and others. So it's not just limited to Rick Snyder. I mean, what do you make of it? And what do you think of the charges and the likelihood of any meaningful condemnation?
Well, it's basically criminal neglect. But to go after a governor for that for something like this, an environmental sort of disaster, is highly unusual. And there'll be those who question whether or not it's politically motivated, whether it's because he's a Republican and people involved in the prosecutorial process are associated or aligned with the Democrats. The Attorney General is currently a very partisan Democratic activist in Michigan. And so I think that will raise some questions. It's opening the door to criminalizing a lot of conduct that I think that's where people have some concerns to the degree that we're going to start criminalizing gubernatorial or well, in this case, gubernatorial, but in other cases, just governmental conduct in general. The flip side, it was an extraordinary disaster. There was extraordinary levels of neglect. It did lead to people dying. So, so I can see why they are pursuing some degree of justice and wanting people at the higher levels to take responsibility and be found accountable. So I think it'll depend on what the facts show ultimately as to whether or not was this a politically motivated prosecution to scapegoat one's opponents and adversaries, or is it an attempt to hold someone accountable and responsible where we have failed to do so in the past, but trying to start to do so where environmental disasters take place on the government's watch.
All right, and 2 things actually to preface that, because this is not an excuse and there's no but. It's a disaster, and there were some, say, outright or overtly, if not criminal elements, borderline corruption elements, as in when they did the tests on the water of the houses, they excluded certain reports that showed toxic levels of lead in the water so as to get adequate results to quell the population that there was no problem. Who made those changes? Who made those requests? Who knows? As far as it goes from a systemic failure, this is decades in the making of infrastructure collapse, bankrupt, a city being, or a state being bankrupt, them having to find cheaper measures to provide services. And one of which was, while we try to redo the water, reroute it to Flint. So, there's more people being charged, but some people are asking, like, why is there no immunity for Snyder versus other politicians who have immunity in the execution of their duties?
Immunity is generally only civil. So you generally don't have immunity from a criminal prosecution, no matter who you are. It's just because the state controls it. That's really the de facto phenomenon that's taking place here. And so I think that that's why the distinction between the two.
Okay, that's a good answer, and it's a short answer. Now, the burden of proof, we have to see where this goes. There's going to be an investigation. Presumably there's been an investigation going on actually for, they say, upwards of 2 years. So presumably they have the information that is required in order to have issued these charges. Do they play the game and up them if there's no plea? Are they going to treat Snyder like an ordinary accused in the criminal system?
In all likelihood, yes, because he's not sitting governor. He's an ex-governor. And they appear to be escalating in what they plan on doing to him and with him. And I think one question will be whether or not other participants could have been culpable, but were not prosecuted because of their political associations. So I think that will be one of the things to watch moving forward, and then to see what the evidence actually shows at a trial. So the concern people have is weaponizing the criminal justice process to target one's political adversaries. But the flip side of that is that there probably should have been more of these in the past, where these kind of disasters have taken place on the government's watch, where the various high-ranking governmental actors are culpable and responsible.
All right, I'm going to read this. Alex Ayala says Trump had 160 million funded to Flint to solve the problem, estimated to cost 30 million to fix. The problem is Michigan is corrupt. They use the money for other jobs so they can ask for more, just like our roads.
Yeah, there's a lot of those. There's a lot of that goes around, unfortunately.
And not to get back to my rant about Quebec lockdowns, but while 1,500 new COVID admissions to the hospitals overwhelms the system, the government finds 13 million a month to spend on COVID awareness. Just not on beds, just $500,000 on an ad. Okay, so that's interesting. We'll see what happens with
where their priorities really are.
Well, it's always an interesting question as to who is in charge of the ad agency, which celebrities are getting hired. It's everybody. The government's good at lining its own pockets through taxpayer dollars with minimal added value for citizens. And it's only going to be a matter of time before actually criticizing the government is deemed to be insurrectionist behavior. Okay, so which lawsuit do you want to do first?